On a cold autumn morning in 1903, a quiet town woke up to a mystery that would haunt it for generations. Six young women, all sisters, vanished from their home in a single night. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, and no clear clues left behind. Their beds were neatly made, their belongings untouched. It was as if they had simply disappeared into thin air. More than a century later, people still wonder what really happened inside Whitmore Manor. At the beginning of the 20th century, Greybridge was the kind of town where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. It was small, quiet, and surrounded by forests and farmland. Life moved slowly there. Most people knew each other, and news spread quickly along Maple Street. Every morning, the loudest sound in town was usually the whistle of the train echoing through the valley. Farmers worked their fields, shopkeepers opened their doors, and children walked to school along dusty roads. But standing on a hill overlooking the town was a house that always seemed a little different. Whitmore Manor. It was a large Victorian house built from dark stone, surrounded by tall iron gates and towering trees. Some people admired the beauty of the place, but others felt uneasy whenever they walked too close. Because the man who lived there was something of a mystery. His name was Tobias Whitmore. No one in Greybridge really knew where he had come from. About 7 years earlier, he had arrived in town with 6 daughters and enough money to build the large manor that now stood on the hill. He kept mostly to himself and lived quietly, but his daughters quickly became well known around town. The oldest was Clara. She was intelligent, calm, and serious, and she worked as a teacher at the local schoolhouse. Many children in Greybridge learned their lessons under her guidance. Nora, the second eldest, was an artist. She spent most of her time painting landscapes and portraits in the bright sunroom of the manor. Then there were the twins, Beatrice and Bonnie. They had opened a small dress shop in town, and their designs quickly became popular among the local women. The 2 youngest sisters, Edith and Lillian, were known for their cheerful personalities. They were often seen laughing together while walking through town or shopping in the market. Together, the 6 sisters brought life and color to Greybridge. People admired them, and many thought the Whitmore family had brought a touch of elegance to the quiet town. But no one could have imagined that one morning everything would change. October 16th, 1903 began like any other day. The Whitmore family's housekeeper, Olive Keller, arrived at the manor just before 7 in the morning. She had worked for the Whitmore family for nearly 10 years and knew the house better than anyone. Normally, by the time she arrived, the manor was already awake. Clara would be upstairs preparing lessons for the school day. Nora might be humming softly while setting up her paints. The twins often discussed business plans in the kitchen while waiting for breakfast. But on that morning, something felt strange the moment Olive stepped through the door. The house was silent, not the peaceful kind of silence that comes before a busy day, but a heavy, uncomfortable quiet. Olive called out softly, "Miss Clara." Her voice echoed through the hallway, but no one answered. She walked slowly through the house, expecting someone to appear at any moment. But the silence continued. Feeling uneasy, she climbed the staircase toward the bedrooms. The hallway upstairs stretched before her with several doors on each side. All of them were closed. She knocked gently on Clara's door before opening it. The room looked perfectly tidy. The bed was neatly made, the books on the desk were stacked in order, and Clara's coat hung neatly by the wall. But the bed felt cold. It was clear that no one had slept there. A strange feeling crept into Olive's chest as she moved to the next room. Nora's studio bedroom was just as tidy. Her paintbrushes were carefully cleaned and placed beside sealed paint tubes. The canvases that normally held half-finished paintings were stacked neatly against the wall. Everything looked too perfect. One by one, Olive checked the other bedrooms. Beatrice, Bonnie, Edith, Lillian. Every room looked the same. Clean, organized, empty. None of the sisters were there. Their clothes remained in the closets. Their shoes were beside the beds. None of their personal belongings were missing. But the sisters themselves were gone. Panic began to rise inside Olive as she rushed down the staircase and ran out into the street. Her cries quickly drew attention. "They're gone," she shouted. "The girls are gone." Within minutes, neighbors began gathering near the gates of Whitmore Manor, trying to understand what had happened. Soon the town sheriff, William Harland, arrived at the scene. Sheriff Harland was known for being practical and calm. He had handled disputes, thefts, and the occasional drunken fight, but nothing like this. 6 missing people in a single night was something the town had never experienced before. He stepped inside the manor and carefully examined the rooms. What he saw only deepened the mystery. There were no broken windows, no forced doors, no signs of violence. Nothing appeared stolen. The house looked as if the sisters had simply vanished. Olive repeated her story again to the sheriff, explaining how she had arrived and found the house completely silent. She insisted that the sisters had been home the previous evening. Several neighbors confirmed that they had seen lights in the manor late the night before. So if the sisters had left, they must have done so sometime during the night. But why would 6 women leave their home without taking anything? As the investigation continued, the sisters' father finally arrived. Tobias Whitmore had been away on business in a nearby town. When he stepped through the gates of the manor, the crowd of townspeople fell silent. The sheriff approached him carefully and explained the situation. For a moment, Tobias said nothing. He looked up toward the empty windows of his home as if searching for something. Then he spoke quietly. They wouldn't leave like this. The sheriff asked him what he meant, but Tobias simply shook his head and refused to say anything more. Over the next several days, the entire town joined the search. Groups of volunteers combed the nearby forests. Others searched along the creek that ran past the manor. Riders were sent to neighboring towns to ask if anyone had seen the missing sisters. But every search ended the same way. Nothing. No clues. No sightings. No explanation. As time passed, whispers began spreading through Greybridge. Some believed the sisters had secretly planned to run away together. Others thought they might have been kidnapped by travelers passing through the area. But there were also darker rumors. Some townspeople began to wonder about Tobias Whitmore himself. Why had he come to Greybridge in the first place? Where had his money come from? And why had he always kept his past a secret? Stories began circulating about strange lights, sometimes seen in the upper windows of the manor late at night. Others claimed they had heard unusual sounds coming from the house after dark. No one could prove any of these claims, but the mystery surrounding the Whitmore family only grew deeper. 2 weeks after the disappearance, investigators made an unexpected discovery inside the manor. Hidden in the attic was a small wooden chest that had been locked. When the sheriff forced it open, he found something surprising. Inside were journals. 6 journals, each belonging to one of the Whitmore sisters. At first, the writings seemed ordinary. They described daily life in Greybridge, visits to the market, and conversations with friends. But as investigators continued reading, they began noticing something unusual. Several entries mentioned their father acting increasingly worried during the weeks before they disappeared. Clara had written that Tobias had started checking the doors and windows repeatedly at night. Nora mentioned that he seemed anxious and distracted. And the youngest sister, Lillian, had written something that caught the sheriff's attention. Just a few days before the disappearance, she had written, "Father says we may have to leave suddenly, but he will not tell us why." This discovery immediately raised new questions. Had Tobias Whitmore planned to take his daughters away? Was the family hiding from something? The sheriff arranged to question Tobias again. But when officers returned to Whitmore Manor the next day, they found the house empty. Tobias Whitmore had disappeared as well. No one in town saw him leave, and no record was ever found showing where he went. Years passed, and the mystery remained unsolved. Some believed Tobias had secretly moved his daughters somewhere far away. Others believed the family had been running from enemies from Tobias's past. And some people believed something far stranger had happened that night. Whitmore Manor eventually stood abandoned. Its once beautiful gardens grew wild, and its iron gates rusted with time. Children in Greybridge grew up hearing the story of the 6 sisters who vanished overnight. Some locals even claimed that on certain nights, faint lights could still be seen moving through the empty windows of the manor. More than 100 years have passed since the Whitmore sisters disappeared. Yet the questions remain the same. Where did they go? Why did they leave everything behind? And what secret was Tobias Whitmore hiding? Until those answers are found, the disappearance of the Whitmore sisters will remain one of the most haunting mysteries in the history of Greybridge. The air inside felt colder. After several steps, the passage opened into a small hidden chamber beneath the attic. The sheriff held his lantern higher and looked around. What he saw surprised him. The room contained several old blankets, empty lanterns, and small crates. It looked as though someone had stayed there for a short time, as if someone had been hiding. Harlan stepped further into the chamber, examining the objects carefully. Then he noticed something sitting on top of one of the crates, a small leather notebook. He picked it up and slowly opened the first page. Written at the top, in careful handwriting, were 2 words: Clara Whitmore. Harlan's heart began to pound. If this journal truly belonged to Clara, it meant the sisters had been in this hidden chamber at some point after the night they supposedly vanished. He turned the pages slowly. The entries described nights spent hiding inside the manor. Clara wrote that their father had told them to remain completely silent and unseen. He believed that dangerous people were searching for the family. According to the journal, Tobias Whitmore feared that if anyone discovered where they were, the sisters would be taken away. For several days they remained hidden in the chamber, waiting for their father to return with news. One entry mentioned that Tobias had left the manor late one evening to meet someone in town, but the following pages contained worried notes. He never returned. Without their father, the sisters were frightened to leave the manor. Clara wrote that they waited in the hidden room, unsure of what to do next. The final entry was written only a few days later. It ended with a single line: "We cannot stay here any longer. Tonight, we will try to leave." After that, the journal ended. There were no further pages, no explanation of where they went, no clue about what happened next. Sheriff Harlan closed the notebook slowly. If Clara's journal was true, then the sisters had survived the night they disappeared. They had been hiding inside the manor all along. But after deciding to leave, something must have happened, because no one in Greybridge had ever seen them again. Harland reported his discovery to the town authorities, but even this new information failed to solve the mystery. Some believe the sisters had managed to escape the town quietly and start new lives somewhere far away. Others believed the danger Tobias feared had finally caught up with them, but no evidence ever appeared to confirm either theory. Whitmore Manor eventually fell into deeper ruin as the decades passed. The gates rusted, the gardens disappeared beneath weeds, and the house stood silent on the hill, watching over the town of Greybridge. Even today, more than 100 years later, the story of the Whitmore sisters continues to fascinate historians and visitors alike. Some people claim that on certain nights, faint lights can still be seen in the manor's upper windows. Others say they have heard footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Whether those stories are true or simply part of the legend, no one knows for certain. But one question has never faded from the memory of Greybridge. What truly happened to the Whitmore sisters on that mysterious night in 1903? The passage was tight and dark, just wide enough for a person to move through sideways. It sloped downward through the interior of the house. For years, the disappearance of the Whitmore sisters slowly turned from a shocking event into a legend whispered throughout Greybridge. New families moved into town, old residents grew older, and life continued much as it always had. But the hill where Whitmore Manor stood never quite lost its shadow. By the winter of 1910, nearly 7 years had passed since the night the sisters vanished. The manor had been empty all that time. Its once polished windows were now covered with dust, and ivy had begun crawling up the stone walls. Most people avoided walking near it after sunset. Still, there were a few who could never forget what had happened there. One of them was Sheriff William Harland. Even after years had gone by, the case continued to trouble him. He had handled many investigations during his career, but none had ever remained so completely without answers. Not a single witness, not a single clue. 6 people simply gone. On one quiet evening in late November, Harlan decided to visit the manor again. The sky was already dark when he reached the hill. A cold wind rustled through the tall trees surrounding the property, and the iron gates creaked as he pushed them open. The path to the house was almost hidden beneath fallen leaves. When he reached the front door, he paused for a moment before stepping inside. The air smelled of dust and old wood. His lantern cast a faint golden glow across the hallway as he slowly walked through the silent house. Every room looked almost exactly as it had the last time investigators searched it years earlier. Furniture remained untouched. Curtains hung still. The sisters' bedrooms upstairs were just as Olive Keller had found them that first morning, perfectly neat and completely empty. Harlan stood for a moment in the hallway, listening to the quiet. Then he heard something, a faint creak. It came from above him, the attic. At first he thought it might only be the wind moving through the old house. But then the sound came again, a slow shifting noise. Someone or something was moving above. Carefully, Harlan walked toward the staircase and began climbing. Each step groaned beneath his weight. The lantern light flickered against the walls as he reached the second floor and looked down the long hallway toward the attic door. It was slightly open. That door had always been closed before. He slowly pushed it wider and stepped into the attic. The room was filled with shadows and dust. Old furniture and broken trunks were stacked in corners beneath the slanted roof. But something immediately caught his attention. Footprints, clear marks in the dust that had settled over the floor. Someone had been there recently. Harlan followed the footprints carefully. They led across the attic toward the far wall. When he reached the end of the trail, he noticed something unusual. A section of the wooden boards looked slightly different from the rest of the wall. He placed his hand against them and pushed. To his surprise, the boards shifted. Behind them was a narrow opening, a hidden passage. Harlan raised his lantern and stepped inside. The passage was tight and dark, just wide enough for a person to move through sideways. It sloped downward through the interior of the house.